remind me the last 2 minutes and I didn't do it here and I forgot, but we've moved on, to remind you that on your test, there are quadratic equations that you have to factor. So just remind me to do one before we leave. All right, completing the square. So we're going to solve each quadratic equation by completing the square. That's not in your test. That's on test 2. Okay, number 1. Okay, suppose we had this. Suppose we had x squared minus 8x plus 15 equals 0. So x squared plus minus 8x plus 15 equal 0. Okay? All right, now remember, always make sure you follow the directions. So that worksheet you're going to get, it'll be mixed up. Some will say solve by quadratic formula. Some will say solve by the square root property. Some will say solve by factoring. Some will say solve by completing the square. Make sure you follow directions. All right, completing the square, you probably don't remember what that involves. You probably touched upon it in previous courses in high school, and then you moved on. But you do need it for circles, so we do have to talk about the procedure for completing the square. So the ones that we're going to deal with, though, the quadratic equations that we're going to deal with, the coefficient of x squared will be 1. All right, so for us, they will be 1. If we have time, I'll show you what to do if it's not 1. But for us right now, it will be 1. So you see the coefficient of x squared is 1, right? Okay. Now remember that the standard form of a quadratic equation looks like what? What's the standard form? Ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Okay, so that's the standard form. All right. So step 1 says this. If a, remember a is called the coefficient of x squared, so that's called the leading coefficient. If a is not 1, then you can divide both sides by a. And this makes the coefficient of x squared 1. Do I have that here? No, because what's the coefficient of x squared? 1. So we're done with 1. So for 1, that step you're not going to do. Now we're going to do 1 at some point just to kind of show you what to do, but basically that's it. All right, step 2. You're going to put all the variables to one side, the constants to the other, and leave some space. In other words, it's going to look like this. X squared minus 8x, leave some space here, equal, and then if I bring the constant over, what does that become? Negative 15. It's very easy to mess that up, so make sure you're careful with your signs. All right, that was step 2. All right, step 3 says we're now going to complete the square. And there are 2 parts to step 3. All right, so that's the part of completing the square. So basically, you're going to take the coefficient of x. What's the coefficient of x?
1.
No, it's not. What's the coefficient of x?
8.
Negative 8. Negative 8. Coefficient of x squared is 1. I hope y'all good now, right? Okay. The coefficient of x is negative 8. Now, a couple of you said 8. It is not 8. It is what? Negative 8. You keep the sign. Okay, now actually do the work on the side. Negative 8. All right, then it says I take half of that. So actually show it. Divide by 2. Whatever that is, if you can simplify, you simplify. But whatever that is, it says I've got to square it. All right, so let's go through this again. So I'm going to take the coefficient of x, which in this case is what?
8.
Negative 8. You're always going to divide by 2. No matter what that number is, you will always divide by 2. And then whatever that is, you're going to square it. Okay? All right, so what's negative 8 divided by 2? And if I square it, what do I get? 16. Okay, I get 16. We're still in part A. We're still in part A of number 3. That says once I do that part, I add it to both sides, because what you do to one side, you do to the other. So I'm going to add 16 to both sides, just like that. Okay? Now, if you did this correctly, you should be able to factor this side. And when you factor it, those two binomials will be the same. So, for example, how do you factor this? XX, 4, and both what? Negative. They're always going to be the same. So you always be able to write this as a binomial squared, just like that. Okay? And that's going to equal whatever this sum is. What's this sum right here? 1. All right, so that was number 3. So if you're doing this correctly, you'll be able to factor the left-hand side, and it'll be a binomial times itself. It'll be a binomial squared. And then I got 1 because negative 15 plus 16 is 1. All right, now, didn't you have this on a previous worksheet? If I covered this part up and I said solve this, how'd you solve this on a previous worksheet? Square root property. Very good. So whenever you complete the square, at some point you're going to use what property? Square root property. And that's the number 4. So number 4 says use the square root property and solve for x. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this over. I'm going to take the square root of both sides. And remember, when you take the square root of both sides, what else do you need to put? Plus or minus. And then remember, the square and the square root into each other. So you get x minus 4 equals plus or minus. Okay, but square root of 1, you know what that is. What is that? It's 1. So the square root of 1, I ended up with a rational number, right? Okay. So there are a couple of ways you can do this now. Since the square root's no longer there, like this is not the square root of 3, square root of 5 is the square root of 1, which is 1. I need for you to tell me, just like we did the previous problem, just like we did this one, I'm going to write like this. I need for you to tell me exactly what those rational solutions are. Okay? So a couple ways you can do this now. You can say, all right, well, that means that x minus 4 equals 2 things. What 2 things do they equal? A positive 1 and a what? Negative 1. You agree? Yep. And notice I went from a from a quadratic equation to 2. What kind of equations are these? Linear. So if I add 4 to both sides and I combine like terms, I get x to equal what? 5. And over here, if I add 4 to both sides, I get x to be positive 3, right? Okay? All right, so those are your solutions. That's completing the square. Okay? All right, let's look at another one. So, on on test 2, you may have one problem completing the square, but I'll give you the steps. But I won't give you the steps for the circle, though. I need for you to be able to do that for the circle. All right, let's look at number 2. Same process. Number 2. Okay, number 2, suppose we had m squared minus 6m minus 55 equals 0. M squared minus 6m minus 55 equals 0. And let's solve this by completing the square. Same directions. All right, what's the first step?
If a is the leading coefficient is not 1, divide both sides by a.
Yeah, so what's the first thing I'm going to do with this then? Move the negative 55 over. All right, so I get m squared minus 6m, leave some space, and that equals what? Positive 55. See, some of you are still saying some wrong signs here. You got to get over that quick, because you'll be upset with me when you get something back. All right, now the ones on your test for completing the square, and I think on the worksheet as well. Notice that the coefficient of m is even, right? It's forget about the negative, but 6, and so I made it to where it was divisible by 2. I made sure that the coefficient of m was divisible by 2. All right, but what's the next step though?
Take the C.
Do it in steps. Do it in sentences.
Take 6.
Take the coefficient of m, which is what?
6.
Nope, not 6. Negative 6. Divide by 2. Whatever that is, I do what? Square it. All right, now simplify this if you can. That's negative 3. And what do I get? 9. All right, so that's where I'm at. Okay, now what's the next thing I do with that 9? Add it to both sides. I add it to both sides. Now, if you're doing this correctly, the left side should be factorable as a binomial times itself. So this should be factorable as a binomial squared. So what do you think that binomial is? M minus 3. M minus 3. And it's always a good idea to look. Remember, I told you specifically be careful with the coefficient of m. Some of you said 6 was negative, right? So you see this negative 3 right here? That's going to be the same as this one. This negative 3, this negative 3. So this was negative 7, and this will be m minus what? 7. Now, that's assuming you did all this correct? Equal, and then that's going to be what? 64? Okay. What's the next step? Square root both sides. So I'm going to go ahead and rewrite this over. Take the square root of both sides. Don't forget, what else must you put? Plus or minus. The square and the square root undo each other. So you get m minus 3 equal plus or minus 8. So I ended up with rational or irrational? I may end up with rational solutions. So I expect you to break it apart. So I need for you to be able to tell me that m minus 3 equals an 8, and m minus 3 equals a what? Negative 8. And so therefore, when you add 3 to both sides, what's one of your solutions?
5.
11.
Negative 11.
8 plus 3 is 11.
Oh, yeah.
Negative 5.
Add 3 to both sides over here, I get m to be a negative 5. Right? Those are your two solutions. All right. Okay, number 3. All right, so it's very straightforward. It's not difficult. All right, number 3, suppose you had x squared minus 8x equal negative 8. X squared minus 8x equals negative 8. All right. So the constant's already on the other side, right? So remember, the first step is to bring all the variables to one side, constant to the other. Well, it's already in that form. But you do need to leave some space between the variables and the constant. So x squared minus 8x, leave some space, equal negative 8. All right, what's the next step? Take the coefficient of x, which is negative 8, divide by 2, and I square it. So negative 8 divided by 2 is, and when I square it, I get 16. Okay? And then what do I do with that 16? Add it to both sides, just like this. So if I'm doing this correctly, the left side, that trinomial, should be factorable. It should be a binomial squared. And if you do this correctly, if you did this correctly, that number you saw right here when you simplify, that negative 4, should be what you would see in here. So it's x minus 4 squared equal 8. You can always check yourself. If you FOIL x minus 4 times x minus 4, you'll get x squared minus 8x plus 16. What's the next step? Square both sides? Someone said I square both sides.
You can't.
Square root.
I square root
Yeah.
both sides. I take the square root of both sides. Plus or minus. All right, so the square and the square root undo each other. So I get x minus 4 equals plus or minus. Now, Is 8 a perfect square? No. So am I going to end up with rational or irrational solutions? Irrational. All right, but I can still simplify the square root of 8. And what perfect square goes into 8? 4. So that's 4 times 2. And the square root of 4 is what? I got 2 square root of 2. So that's 2 square root of 2 right here, right? One more step and you're done because you can leave it since it's irrational. Since those are irrational solutions, you can leave it in compact form like that plus or minus. All you got to do is bring that 4 over and you're done. So what's the answer? 4 plus or minus 2 square root of 2. There's your answer. Notice the difference between 3 and the previous 2. So these are irrational. The previous 2 were rational. All right. So completing a square, same steps over and over. And a lot of that's a review from previous classes about simplifying radicals and all that. All right, number 4. Suppose we had this in number 4. So number 4, suppose we had m squared equal negative 14m minus 37. M squared equals negative 14m minus 37. Okay, so look at what you have and think about, if I want to do this by completing the square, think about what it is I've got to do first. I got to bring the variables one side. So I got to add 14m to both sides. So I'm going to end up with m squared and then what? Plus 14m, leave some space, and that's going to equal negative 37. All right, now what's the next step? Take the coefficient of m, which is 14. Do what to that? Whatever that is, I will square. So that becomes what number squared? 7. And what is that? 49. So I'm going to add 49 to both sides, right? So I get so if I'm doing this correctly, this should now be factorable, a binomial times itself. So what should that be? M plus 7, right? Squared equal, and what's that? Negative 37 plus 49. 12? All right, so that's where I'm at. Now what's the next step? Take the square root of both sides, plus or minus. The square and the square root undo each other. So you get m plus 7 equals plus or minus. All right, is 12 a perfect square? No, but can you simplify it? Yes. What's the largest perfect square that goes into 12? 4. So I can write this as 4 times 3. And what's the square root of 4? So that's 2 square root of 3. So that goes here. One more step and you're done. So I end up with irrational solutions, right? So just bring this 7 over and you're done. So what's the answer? Negative 7 plus or minus 2 square root of 3. Okay? I'm trying to do one where we get imaginary solutions. So I'm hoping this is it. I could be wrong. Okay. So what do I do next?
Constants on one side,
Variable on one side, constant to the other. So what does it got to do?
move the 1 over.
So what does I got to do to both sides? Subtract 1, right? So I get k squared minus 4k equal negative 6, right?
No.
No?
Yes.
Okay. I thought I could do that in my head. There are some times when I can't do things in my head, but I thought I could do that one. Okay, what's the next step? Take the coefficient of, that's a k. K, and what's the coefficient of k? Do what to that?
Divided by 2.
Whatever that is, I'm going to do what to it? Square it. So that's going to be what squared? What squared? What squared? What goes out in parentheses? Negative 2. So what do I get when I square it? 4. So what do I do to both sides? Add 4 to both sides. What? So this should now be what kind of trinomial? Yeah, we call that a perfect square trinomial. Perfect square trinomial. So all these are perfect square trinomials because you can write it as a binomial squared. Trinomial. So binomial squared. And what is that binomial? K what? Minus 2. Equal negative 2. All right, so that's where I'm at. So I get k minus 2 squared equals a negative 2. All I did was just rewrite it. Okay, now what's the next step? Square root of both sides. Plus or minus, right? Now remember, when we talk about solutions, we've talked about real numbers and imaginary numbers. So real numbers, our solution is either rational or irrational, or the other one would be imaginary, right? So see how I get the square root of a negative number? Is that going to be a real number or an imaginary number? Imaginary. So you're also going to use what idea here? That I. So the square root of a negative 2 is just what? I. Okay, so let me kind of remind you about something. I can write this as square root of negative 1 times 2, right? And the square root of a negative 1 is what? I. So it's I square root of 2. I square root of 2. So I get the square and the square root undo each other. So I get k minus 2 equals plus or minus I square root of 2. One more step and you're done. What's the next step? Add 2 to both sides. So what's the answer? 2 plus or minus I square root of 2. Okay? So those are those are imaginary solutions. And that was it. That was solving equations by completing the square. Okay? Not that difficult. Just the same steps over and over and over again. And it wasn't that bad because all the stuff we discussed was from previous classes. All the stuff here was from previous classes. The only new one was the procedure, the steps. All right, so that was completing the square.